Okay, I know it's early. Well, it's still on, but my son is autistic, and when he was going through school, the absolute surprise by the teachers, and they were really surprised and a bit kind of shocked when I turned around and said, you know, discipline him. If he's in trouble, if he does something wrong, tell him off. He has to be in trouble for him, just like all the other kids. I mean, of course, you know, there have to be some rules that have to be kind of bent for him because of his condition. But as a rule, you know, he has to understand there are rules and boundaries. But I know that not every parent does this. Now, I can't speak for every single child who has special needs, or every condition that is classified as special needs, because I only know of what my experience is. My son is autistic. I have been very lucky. He is on the higher end of the spectrum. Well, he kind of is in the middle, but kind of middle, higher kind of thing. He has every social and emotional issue of the autism. I've spent my entire life as a mother since I found out. Since he was about 5, learning how to counteract it to a point. That sounds a bit weird. He has a lot of obsessions. He has a lot of collections. There was times where he wanted, when he gets things in his head that he obsesses about, he becomes them, especially when he was younger. And we had to work with the school to accommodate them. So when he was 5, 6 years old, he was convinced he was a hobbit. It took me about a year or so to convince him he wasn't a hobbit. So he decided he was half hobbit. This particular obsession lasted about 3 years. Every time somebody said something or did something and said that he wasn't and that was wrong and it's impossible, he got really upset and cried and got cross and got in people's faces, and I had to work very closely with the schools to try and counterbalance this. But there had to be consequences for that behaviour. And although he couldn't control it, and he couldn't, and I knew he couldn't control it, and the school knew he couldn't control this, because it was an absolute belief that this is what he was. And we were working with his paediatrician and everything else, and we couldn't control this, and the doctors were absolutely convinced he couldn't control this obsession and this belief in himself, that this was what he was. There were consequences to this behaviour. You know, it was okay for him to get upset. It was not okay for him to shout and scream. You know, so if he shouted, screamed, and got in people's faces, he had to be taken to one side. He had to be taken indoors, especially if he was at school. He had to be isolated from other students, and it sounds really harsh, but there were consequences. He had to understand that there were rules and regulations, and they didn't care. It didn't matter that he had issues. You know, there had to be boundaries, there had to be rules, there had to be this thing that went on that, regardless of what happened, regardless of his condition, he wasn't allowed to get away with behaving like that. When this obsession finally ended, it made life much easier, but he moved on to other things, and though he never believed he was anything else but human, he started collecting stuff, and then he had to have something of that with him at all times, which was fine, and the school allowed it, but it had to stay on his desk or in his drawer. Inside classrooms, it had to stay in his drawer whether he liked it or not. So it was close by, and he could keep it there, but he wasn't allowed to hold on to it. You know, so there were rules and regulations. You know, if he was he was allowed to take it out to play with him. But when he was inside the classroom, he had to put it in his drawer, or on his desk, or whatever it was, or he had to keep it in his locker or in his bag. It was not allowed to be in his hand at all times. You know, and it was bizarre that we had to have these rules and regulations. But if I didn't, and if we didn't work with the school, he would grow up believing that he had the right to do whatever he wanted because he was autistic, and it was him, and because that was his life and that's how his brain worked, he could get away with anything, but he can't. And he learned pretty easily. See, the one thing about autistics is they learn really easily, and although they panic really easily, they learn very quickly. And it's a very insane concept for most people. But, you know, if you teach them a concept, they will pick it up. They don't like it, and they get panicky. And if he got panicky and, you know, in the classroom, if something changed in the classroom and they didn't tell him about it, they forgot to tell him about it, he was allowed to go to, there was a safe space for him in school that he went to where somebody would be with him. I would get a phone call to say that this has happened, he's gone to a safe space, everything's okay. He's got his thing, whatever it was at that moment, with him. He's being kept calm, everything's okay. When he's safe, he'll come back. That's how we worked with the school. But it was a very tight-knit concept that children learn things at their own pace, they do. But autistics learn things at a very insane pace. They are these highly intelligent people, and people forget that, and they talk down at them. My son hates that. He really hates that. But they have their obsessions, they have their collections, they have their things that keep them safe and sane and very kind of there. And when they're feeling very insecure, which happens a lot when things change, when things happen that they don't expect to happen, they need a safe thing or a safe space. You know, a lot of them are prone to depressions because the world around them doesn't stay the same, and they don't stay the same. They change, they grow up, they get bigger, then their hormones kick in. And when that happens, they feel very, very unhappy, they feel very insecure, especially within themselves. And it's a very, very hard time for them. But you have to work very closely with everybody around you. There has to be a support network. But if you don't teach them to discipline, rules and boundaries, they grow up believing that their behaviour, that their temper tantrums, their stresses, they're allowed to do that. And I've seen it. I have seen that happen. That when people with children with autism go out and about, they start freaking out and they get given, and people just, their parents just go, well, he has autism or he's this and it's fine because, just ignore him. He's autistic, it's fine, it's fine, rather than try to explain to the child that, have this, calm the child down and say, look, this is what's going on, have this is yours, keep safe, keep it, don't cuddle them, don't touch them, because they don't like that. Rather than try and calm the child down, they tell everybody around them that they're autistic and, it's okay, this is normal. But it's not. It's not normal. It really isn't. Whereas if it's more normal for you to give a child, see, when you go out with an autistic, something I learned, I had to learn it pretty quickly, is that when you go out with someone who's autistic, is to always take with you something that comforts them. So that when they have when they get into that moment when they're stressing out and something's freaking them out because something's happened, and it inevitably does because you're in the real world and the real world doesn't work the way they want it to, you know, you can hand that to them, you can stop, you can tell them to hold it, cuddle it, and just give them a moment and say, look, I know it's not the way you want it to, and you can explain it to them, give them a moment. You can tell people around you, you know, they're autistic, you know, I'm dealing with it, you know, carry on, move along, I'm dealing with it. But you don't tell everyone around you that it's normal for them to freak out and just ignore him, you know, or her, or whoever. You know, oh, that's all right, they're freaking out, it's okay, it's normal, and carry on, and let them continue to freak out. Your job is to calm them down as a parent. Give them something to calm them down, something to create an atmosphere around them where they feel safe. We're parents, you know. And then when they're calming down, you carry on. You then have a conversation with them, which is a bit more reasonable. And they begin to slowly but surely, and eventually they'll probably give you a hug, or they'll hold your hand, you know, which is probably more to the point they want to hold your hand, and you'll carry on. My son is 18, and he still holds my hand if he's having a freak out. If he's feeling insecure, he'll have hold of whatever it is that's comforting him, and he'll have hold of my hand, you know, because it makes him feel safe, you know. And that, he's calm, he's collected, and he's happier. But I'm not making excuses for his behaviour. I'm teaching him that the world isn't just going to revolve around him. It's not going to give in to his required whatever's going on. It's going to do whatever it does, and he's going to have to adjust. You know, and as hard as it is for him to adjust, this is what we do when he needs to adjust. So, when he freaks out and the world is scaring him, you know, and when school scared him, the teachers did exactly the same thing. They gave him something to comfort him, they put him in a safe space, and the teachers called me, and I spoke to him sometimes if it was particularly bad. If it wasn't bad enough, they were able to calm him down and reason with him, and then he was fine, and he went back to class and carried on. But he was not allowed to get away with behaviours that were destructive just because he's autistic. Destructive behaviours were not allowed. He's not allowed to scream and shout in people's faces. It's wrong. He's not allowed to, you know, push people, hit people, because it's wrong, just because he's having a freak out. And I know that some people say, well, he's autistic, they do that, you know, he's having a bad moment. I don't care. He's a human being. And they're human beings. And you do not hit people. You do not scream in their faces. You don't like being screamed at. And if you don't like being screamed at, they don't like being screamed at. If you don't want people to hit you, you don't hit them. And there are consequences to behaviours like that. And he doesn't like those consequences, and he doesn't like having that behaviour directed at him. Therefore, I don't allow that behaviour directed at other people by him. You know, I don't like violence. I've always taught him that violence is wrong, regardless of who it is that's being violent, whether people are being violent towards others or being violent towards him. And I certainly do teach that violence is never the answer, regardless how he feels. He should never become violent towards other people. And if he does, there are consequences to that behaviour. You know, I know that there are autistics out there that are very prone to anger. I know that. I know that happens. But I do believe that if that's the case, there should be consequences to that behaviour. I know that they can't always control that anger. I am well aware of that. But that doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences to them behaving like that. You know, just because they can't control a lot of the behaviours doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences to it. He can't always control when he yells, screams, shouts and pushes people. He's never been seriously violent. I've been really lucky. He's never been so violent that he's thrown things, kicked, hit, thrown. Yeah, he's only ever, he's hit a couple of people over the head with books and he's pushed a few people. But he's never been openly violent to the point where he's picked things up and thrown things. And I know that there are autistics out there that have done that and are like that as that's how they work. You know, they can't control that when they lose their temper, they can't always control that. But when he loses his temper and when he can't control that behaviour, I make sure that there are consequences to that. He loses privileges when that happens. When it happened in school, he got detentions. And at home, he lost privileges. I know that it's not his fault, completely his fault. He can control it. Doesn't mean that it's right. And I know that this video will probably get a bit of a backlash, but I don't care. There are rules and boundaries in this world. Things change. Autistics have to learn to adapt. They're not good at adapting. They're very, very bad at adapting. And I don't know what it's like for other children with special needs because I have no opinion on it. I've never dealt with it. But I do know that autistics have never, I do know that they don't adapt. They just don't. They're very bad at adapting. They don't like things that change. They don't like things that don't do the way they do things. And, you know, they're very bad at things like that. And it scares them. And they freak out and they get all wah! And they have mental breakdowns and they fall apart and they curl up in corners and they cry and they freak out and they get cross and they get angry and, you know, they do all these things when everything around them changes and when things go wrong and when things don't go the way they want them to and when things change around them. But if we as parents of them, as their parents, it's our job to teach them and show them that there are other ways to handle that so that when they have those moments in the world, because we won't be here forever, to show them and to teach them and to help them through them. So they have to be able to adapt in ways that are much healthier. And they do learn. They do. They learn very well. So if we can teach them how to survive these moments in the world in ways that are going to help them in the future in healthier ways, so that their brain doesn't just immediately go and lash out and get angry. It's okay if it goes inwards and they just want to cuddle something, because that's doable, that's helpful. We can do that. You know, it's harder to deal with a child that's lashing out. So we can help a child, we can help them adapt, because they do. It's rather amazing to watch it, actually. They learn rather incredibly, and it can happen. Not all of them, I must admit, I will say that, not all of them can. But some of them can adapt. Not all of them, and I will iterate that. If they are on the very low end of the spectrum, right at the bottom, they probably can't. The further up they go, it's easier to help them. But if they are on the low end, I will concede that. It's probably harder for them to adapt and to adjust. But the higher up they go, it's easier for them. You still struggle, we still have issues, they still get lost, they still have those moments, and they will curl in on themselves, and if they're out and about on their own, God, you're in trouble. Especially if they're through moments, you are in serious trouble. I have my name and my address, my name and my number tagged onto everything he owns, so that when he has those moments and he's out and about on his own, and he goes up to somebody, he can go, help. And it blatantly says, I'm autistic. Help. And somebody will call me. And it's happened a couple of times. Well, I've got these random phone calls going, your son's here. Help. And I phone my son. And I've got this very shaky kid on the end of a phone because he's in college and doesn't know where he is or what he's doing. You know, and I've had to go and collect him, you know, because he wanted to be independent and do it all by himself, which is fine. And I have no issue with that. Like I said, he's on the more independent end of the spectrum. But with everything attached to him, when things happen, I have eyes and ears pretty much fucking everywhere. I have support workers fucking everywhere. And I make sure that no matter what happens, he's safe. And these random phone calls where he's decided to go for a walk rather than come straight home, and then got lost, and then freaked out, and then I've got on these random phone calls because he's freaked out and didn't know where he was. It turned out he was pretty much somewhere where I knew exactly where he was, and he didn't really get lost, and he just freaked out because, you know, you just had one of those moments. But yeah, it happens, you know, and yeah, and I had to go and collect him, you know, and it turned out he wasn't anywhere weird. He just sort of gotten lost in his own head, forgotten what he was supposed to be doing, and thought he was lost, and he really wasn't, you know. And it took me about 15 minutes to go and find him. So yeah, he wasn't really lost, he just thought he was, and he freaked out, and yeah, it wasn't that big of a deal really. Yeah. So yeah, it happens on the odd occasion where he's decided he's going to be doing something, you know, and it's not that big a deal in reality, but to him something serious has happened and he's just gone, ah. So yeah, and I would much rather him do things like that, knowing that he's got a phone, by the way, he can call me, but when he gets into those moments, he forgets, which is why I am tagged all over him. He's got bracelets, he's got numbers, he's got labels, I'm all over him. I have my name and my number are tagged all over him, so that people know that he's not just some weirdo, that he's got an issue and that they need to help him by calling me. Yeah. But yeah, it is hard, and I understand the struggle more than anyone, but you cannot allow behaviours to go unchecked just because they have needs and their brain works differently. I have seen it far too many times when parents decide, oh well, they're autistic, they can get away with anything. No, they can't, because that sets them up for failure as adults. It sets them up for failure all through life. How are they ever going to get through life if they can't adjust to anything? Or if they don't know how to adjust to how the world works? When they have a freak out, when something happens, how are they ever going to survive it if you don't teach them how? And don't teach them that behaviours have consequences. Because that's our job anyway as parents. It's okay to say, yes, they're autistic, and yes, they have issues, and yes, you do have to bend the rules for them sometimes, you know, because their behaviours are the way they are. My son's school allowed him to wander as much as the other kids hated it, but they did. They allowed him to wander around the school during break times and lunch times because it made him feel safe. None of the other kids were allowed to do that. They had to stay outside or they had to do other things. He was the only one who was allowed to do that because it made him feel safe. He was allowed in areas that none of the others were allowed in because it made him feel safe. So he was given privileges in the school because it kept him safe in his head. You know, he was allowed in and out of classes. He had passes in and out of classes because, you know, it kept him in a safe space for learning. A lot of his classes were done in a learning centre. You know, they would send the work with him. His teachers knew when he walked into the classroom what kind of mood he was in, and if he wasn't in a learning mood, they would throw him out and go to this place where they'd talk to him, they'd calm him down, and then they'd send him back, where he was calm and collected and ready to learn. You know, if he was ready to learn, they would sit him down, they would be ready for him, he would do his learning, and if he got to a point in the lesson where he was stressing out and freaking out and whatever else out, they would throw him back into the learning centre, where they would deal with him, calm him down, or they would keep him there with his lesson, with the rest of his lessons, and he'd do his work there. It worked, and he left school with really good grades. He passed all his classes. I was so impressed. You know, he left school with amazing grades. He passed everything. I mean, wow. Couldn't have asked for better. I really couldn't, you know. And the thing is, it worked. And they did the same in primary school. But every bad behaviour was disciplined. He wouldn't get away with anything, ever. You know. But he was given privileges over the other students. Because otherwise he couldn't learn. You know, and it worked for everybody. You know, so they took into account his condition and they worked it into his schooling. But they disciplined him for his bad behaviour on my orders and my say-so. I don't know if they did that for all the autistics in the school, because there were a few. But they certainly did it for him. And it did the same in primary school, and I did the same here at home. When he was disciplined at school for whatever bad behaviour, he got it here at home too. And when he wasn't at school, if he did something he wasn't supposed to, he lost privileges. You know, it's not easy raising children, whether they're special needs or whether they're not. But it's our job as parents to prepare them for the real world. And the real world, as we all know, is cruel and scary and doesn't just allow us to do whatever the fuck we want. Being an adult isn't always fun. It's weird, that, isn't it? And we as parents have to prepare them for that. And when you've got a kid who can't deal with that, you have to make sure they can at least survive it. And it's not easy. It really isn't. But we are remiss as parents with autistics if we don't try. if we excuse the bad behaviours, if we excuse the tantrums and the yelling and the shouting and the aggression, by just going to everybody and saying, well, they're autistic, so they can just get away with it. We can't do that, because if we do that, we are not doing our job. We are setting them up for failure. Complete failure. By addressing the behaviours, by helping them calm down, by helping them understand what's happening around them and why that's happening to them, by helping us to understand them and why that's happening to them and what's making them like that. Because you'll probably find it's something really simple, like something changed around them, or somebody's tone of voice was wrong, or and if it was a tone of voice, which is inevitably a lot of things, especially when it happens at schools or happens around them, the tone of voice is inevitable, because teenagers' tones of voices are horrible, we all know that. And they say boo to them, they say hi to them in the wrong tone of voice, they're going to go, they're going to get really freaked out because they'll think they've done something wrong. So, I mean, it's one of those moments where if you don't try to understand why they're behaving that way, you can't help them to correct it, or at least survive that behaviour. This is why we're doing this. They're not saying it because of this, they're not doing this because of that. And the one thing I try to teach mine is that they're not saying it that way because they're cross at you. It's because of this, or it might be because of this. It's not you, it's them. If it's a tone of voice, it's not you, it's them. And I try to help him remember that, so that it doesn't flood his brain and make him go, Here at home, we have a system. Where I explain if I'm tired, or if I'm this, or if I'm that, so that he understands it's not him, it's me. Or if I've changed my tone and I haven't noticed it myself, he will point it out to me and I will apologise and then explain it. See what I mean? Tone of voice is very important to them, so they have to understand where it's coming from, so they don't take it personally. Things like, if things are changing around them, things are changing inside them, they need to understand that too. And they can't always. And those conversations are really difficult. And things like that are so hard. And they're constant conversations. And I know it doesn't apply to all autistics, because the lower end of the spectrum is hard. And I don't have an opinion on the lower end, because obviously mine is more independent. But I can imagine it being fairly similar. I said fairly, not completely. But we need to help them survive the world. They'll never understand it completely. They'll never be completely able to control the behaviours that they have, or whatever. That will never happen. But if we can help them survive it a little better and make it a little easier for them, we have to. And if we can help them understand, or try to understand, that it's not always going to be their fault, and it's not always up to them, and not everything is, it's very strange that the world behaves the way it does, but it's not always personal. If they can understand that, it might make it a little easier for them. they'll still have moments, they'll still have issues, they'll still have temper tantrums, and they'll still have their meltdowns and their stresses and their issues. But if we can help make it a little easier for them, help them survive it, it'll be much better for them when they're adults, rather than excuse the behaviour, because that's not our job. We're parents. We shouldn't be excusing the behaviour. We should be helping the behaviour find its, find its equilibrium, I think. Help it just sort of equal out of it, so that we can help them to find some kind of peace. It's going to be hard enough. Without them not understanding anything. And if you don't teach them, and if you just make excuses for the behaviour, they'll never learn. And they are so intelligent. So intelligent. So teach them, help them, make their lives just that little bit easier.